Okay, well, greetings. My name is Sonya Douglas, and I'm a faculty member at Teachers College, Columbia University, where I also serve as the director of the Black Education Research Center, which is focused on the promotion of racial equity to support the education of all students through culturally sensitive research, through curriculum and professional learning opportunities, and through community engagement and community capacity building. It is truly my honor and pleasure to join this year's Lemann Center Colloquium, focused on research and equity in education. As you know, in the US and throughout the world, the field of education continues to confront the challenges associated with ensuring that children and youth of all backgrounds, no matter their race, their socioeconomic status, their gender, or ability, have access to a high-quality learning experience that affirms who they are culturally and academically and socially, and that leads to positive learning outcomes. As nations divided by race, culture, and politics attempt to determine how to promote racial equity in schools, ensuring that every child gets what they need to learn and to be successful, these efforts depend largely upon the purpose and values of a particular nation or country or peoples and what type of community they seek to live in. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. observed here in the United States, he said that we must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools. And so this is the struggle that we continue to engage as educators, as researchers, as nonprofit leaders, advocates, and activists committed to advancing racial equity in educational systems. And so much of my work and scholarship to date is focused on the problem of educational inequality in the United States, with a focus on race, which will thus serve largely as the basis for my remarks today, with the hope and intention that the lessons learned from the United States might inform the promotion of racial equity efforts in Brazil and educational communities worldwide. I will also draw from the report authored by my colleague, Dr. Brant Grant, and myself, entitled A Selected Review of International Policies and Programs that Promote Racial Equity in Education, again, to help frame the discussion that we're having around racial equity in schools and how research and particular research methodologies, particularly those that focus on culturally sensitive approaches and use a critical lens, can help to address and reduce inequality in education. In the last 3 decades, we have seen a swift and historic shift in education policy in the United States and in places throughout the world, with an impressive cadre of educational leaders, policymakers, and advocates working diligently in communities across the country to improve and transform schools and districts by both naming the problem of inequality and racial inequities, given the nation's longstanding policy of separate but equal schooling, separate but equal education, and I put that in quotes, separate but equal, as it was never equal, but actively finding ways to address that history and to reduce the problem of inequality. In our attempts to work to close achievement gaps and expand opportunity to students, we also have been working to provide the academic, social, emotional, and cultural supports and approaches that are needed to really create and sustain inclusive learning environments where all children feel welcome and all feel that they belong. Despite these efforts in this movement and its acceleration through the support of private and corporate philanthropy and a progressive political agenda in some places that has fueled efforts to promote equity and diversity, and also most recently anti-racism efforts, the research base upon which this work is being developed often frames inequality in education as the problem of one group simply needing more of something, whether it's greater resources, access, opportunity. And therefore, the solution becomes, in the case of racial equity, for example, that we must focus on how we determine how we begin to give each underserved, under-resourced, or marginalized child from a marginalized racial group what it is they need to be successful educationally. Today, however, I argue that the research methodologies and evidence that we use, which are critical to advancing equity, really must recast the problem of inequality, particularly racial inequality, is more than a problem of the haves and have-nots, the disadvantaged and the advantaged, or the subjugated and oppressed versus the privileged, but rather help us to understand why certain groups have and others have not, and why certain groups remain advantaged while others continue to be disadvantaged when it comes to education. This also requires that we take time to understand the history and function of how race and cultural inequality has manifested itself in schools and society, at the local level, at the state level, and nationally, and to consider the ways that the politics of race and the politics of difference continue to inform the distribution of power and resources in education, which we know have tremendous implications for the extent to which students can learn and can learn in ways that are beneficial to them. The politics of race also has major implications for policy making and the political process, which also has implications for the types of research evidence that is received by policymakers and what really counts as research evidence. And so our focus on the research methodologies that we use and the evidence that it produces is really essential to the work of achieving equity of any kind. The William T. Grant Foundation has conducted extensive research that shows that for research to be used, it must be responsive, routine, and relational. That is coming from a trusted source. But despite the significant time and attention given to issues of equity on education reform for many decades, the state of education for children of color in particular remains astonishingly poor in terms of investment, as well as the knowledge base upon which their schooling has been conceptualized, developed, delivered, and evaluated. And so I argue that this is a major oversight and limitation of the research on race and education, which has held really significant and important implications for what has happened in U.S. education, and thus providing important lessons learned for other nations, such as Brazil, who are interested in really tackling the issue of inequality and engaging in the work of promoting racial equity. And so while I personally embrace the spirit of a vision of education that believes that it is the great equalizer of the conditions of people, we are constantly reminded that despite the ideals that we have about education, they continue not to be the case for too many children who come from a racial background or cultural background or a class background that does not provide them access to the resources that they need to be successful. And so I want to share a quote from a scholar, a professor from the City College of New York, Donald Smith, who said, quote, in the case of African Americans in the United States, quote, education is a two-edged sword. It is the most powerful social force in the history of humankind. It may be used to empower or to enslave, to enlighten or to mystify, to clarify or to confuse, to ennoble or dehumanize, but education is never neutral. He continued that historically, education has most often been used as a socializing process to secure the rights and privileges of those in control, while at the same time limiting the opportunities and life chances for those viewed as inferior and unworthy. Education, thusly employed, becomes a form of domination and oppression. Unfortunately, much of the research being conducted relative to racial equity in education either discovers this inequality through racial and socioeconomic comparisons, which are helpful to documenting and revealing the nature and depth of differences in the treatment or resources available to different racial groups. There is an opportunity for us to increase the value and effectiveness of policy recommendations when they're grounded in a better understanding in the nature and the sources of inequality, which requires us to reframe, again, the problem of racial inequality from the perspectives of those closest to the problem, from the perspectives of the marginalized and the oppressed. Sadly, these failed results have further weakened trust in the education system, which reinforces the idea that it was never really designed to be the great equalizer that many hoped it would. And so now, again, we continue to figure out how we can fix this system and correct it so that all children have access to a high-quality learning experience. And in the 1990s, another scholar, Dr. Beverly Gordon, emphasized the importance of centering, in this case, an African-American way of understanding and seeing the world and thinking about educational theory and practice when she made this observation, quote, she said that the 21st century will be marked by the struggles of people of color for position, credibility, and respect within Western societies. The greatest battle will be for control over who educates minorities within Western societies and the nature of that education. Whose vision of the role of African Americans other people of color, and the disenfranchised will prevail. For what purposes might people of color be educated? How might education assist people of color in challenging the societal structures that maintain and reproduce inequality? And so again, we see here strands of focusing on education not simply as a way to improve outcomes on test scores or to increase measures, which we do believe have a purpose and a value in terms of knowing whether or not students are learning and able to achieve, but also really making sure that we also recognize the linkages between education and liberation, and to really draw from the work of Paulo Freire and others who have really framed education as the practice of freedom. And so how do we ensure that students of color have access to an education that not only teaches them the content that they need, whether it's in reading, writing, mathematics, science, and the arts, but that also empowers them to change the societal structures that will then allow us to facilitate and sustain racial equity in schools. And so one of the ways that we can do this from a research perspective, which is really important, again, to how we engage with nonprofit organizations as well as policymakers, is by centering and valuing critical race perspectives and approaches to studying the problem of inequality. Again, it's important that we document the inequalities, but at this stage, in advancing equity, it's really important that research is focused on what must be done to reduce it. So what actions need to be taken? What is our theory of change? What are the logics that we're using to really ensure that the material experiences of children in classrooms and schools is changed, and that they're able to access curriculum and pedagogical approaches that improve, again, their ability to absorb information and to be more effective in benefiting, or not more effective, but being able to benefit from the quality of that education. And so one of the things that I have advanced in my work is using a critical policy analysis approach to really center issues of power when we look at equity. And so again, whether it's racial equity, gender, ability, geography, you name it, it's important to look at the power dynamics that lead to the fact of whether or not students have access to resources and representation in schools. And much of this requires us asking a different set of questions, again, that centers the voices, experiences, and perspectives of people of color. So for example, questions that we might ask going forward include, how might research evidence that centers the perspectives of people of color in Brazil be used to inform an educational vision and agenda for racial equity? How would greater racial diversity and representation among researchers and those who are charged with advancing racial equity and the promotion of racial equity influence what research evidence is valued and how it is applied in the policy space? Whose research evidence will be trusted in terms of quality, of methodology, of rigor, and representativeness of the policy problems facing communities of color? And ultimately, how will that work then impact policy, action, and social change? And so when it comes to the use of research evidence and its potential impact and power on the transformation of educational systems, I would argue that there's no greater lever for change right now than by providing policymakers, administrators, and school and systems level leaders who are committed to racial equity, the research evidence that is relevant, that is routine, that is relational, that comes from a trusted source, that centers the perspectives of peoples of color, those who, again, who are closest to the problems of inequality, and continuing to ask ourselves the critical questions across research, policy, and practice communities to make sure that the research that we generate, again, empowers the very communities that we seek to serve. And so I close with a call to remind us that even in our framing of equity in education, that equity also becomes a lever for achieving the goals of efficiency, of effectiveness, of ensuring that students, again, are still able to demonstrate proficiency, are able to increase and improve on their learning outcomes, but that they're also doing that in ways that really foster their creativity, their innovation, their interest in being a part of the civic process, and to helping to change the societal structures that now have required us to have a focus on the promotion of racial equity. And so research evidence capturing this perspective is the type of work that must be supported, as it is foundational to any racial equity or social justice agenda in education, or public policy, and that will allow us to move beyond simply discovering or documenting inequality, and move toward a body of scholarship that will serve as the basis for a theory of change and action and the promotion of racial equity in education. Thank you for your time.